My guest today is Dr. Rex Beaber, who's a psychologist who has experience working with the Los Angeles Police Department, evaluating people who are arrested for murder. He is also a lawyer, and we're going to talk about the Texas shooter, Salvador Ramos, and analyze it from a mental health perspective. Thank you for taking the time to do the interview.
I'm delighted.
So I'll start off by saying, we offer our prayers to the families affected by the shooting. It's hard to know what to say to the people who are affected by this, both who have lost people and who could be emotionally scarred for the rest of their lives. Hopefully this discussion will provide some insight, and we'll talk about how this potentially could be prevented in the future. So I'll start off by saying, could you tell us a little bit about your experience with LAPD?
Yes, my experience with law enforcement isn't just with LAPD. I have a relationship with a number of prosecutors and police departments throughout Southern California. And basically the relationship is this. At some point in time, I took the position talking to district attorneys that the only way to evaluate accurately and scientifically somebody's claim of insanity was to do an interview within moments of the crime if possible. And what happened is, after I made that statement in a public speech, various district attorneys, police captains, detectives of homicide got in touch with me and said, we want to have you be on 24-hour call. And when a murder takes place that has suspicious circumstances, it has the earmarks of being committed by a mentally ill person, where we see the likelihood of a psychiatric defense being promulgated, we want to be able to have you come to the murder scene as quickly as possible and do the evaluation that you claim is dispositive.
So you would literally talk to someone hours after they committed a murder?
Correct. I've talked to people, not dozens and dozens of people over the years. We're talking about more than 20 years of practice, of course. And many of them I interviewed at the place of the homicide. In fact, one of my most notorious interviews took place in the emergency room of a hospital because the suspect had been shot. I interviewed him while the bullet was being removed from his arm.
Wow, okay. So what was a typical night or day for you? You literally get a page, come to the scene, presumably everything is secure by then, and you talk to the person right then and there?
I get usually a telephone call. Remember, most of the work that I did is before the internet. I would get a phone call asking me to come. Unfortunately, most people who commit murder are fairly inconsiderate people, so they didn't do it in daylight hours when I wasn't sleeping. I had to go in the middle of the night, sometimes 3, 4 in the morning. And I'd say the most frequent caller, by the way, was not LAPD, but the Ventura County Detectives Unit.
So what were some typical cases you would see? Like what type of scenarios would you come across?
A high percentage of them were domestic homicides, which are one of the dominant forms of homicide in America. Some of them were people killing neighbors. Some of them were people killing absolutely at random, because psychotic people do that. And some of them involved, not a large number, but some of them even involved killings at educational institutions.
So what type of people commit murder, and what are their motives? Why do they commit murder?
Well, there are roughly 3 kinds of people who commit murder. There are the people who have antisocial personality disorder, or what some people call sociopathic personality disorder. That's one group. Usually doing it for some personal gain reason, or some revenge reason, or some other relatively rational reason. Then there's the psychotic killer. He commits his murder largely in response to delusions and hallucinations. I'll give an example of that that'll make it clearer. I examined one particular fellow who had killed his wife, who was visiting him on the inpatient unit at Camarillo State Hospital. He was being hospitalized for his aggressive impulses. He went out for a walk with her in the garden, pulled out a gun and shot her right there at the hospital, went back to the hospital and said to them, I think I've just killed my wife. When I interviewed him, I discovered that he was a very religious man, and he had a belief that the sentence in the marriage vows, till death do us part, was an instruction from God to him personally to kill his wife if she violated the vows. He had a delusion that she had violated his vows. And so he regarded his killing of his wife as commanded by God. This kind of bizarre internal mental process is something you only see in people who are psychotic, usually schizophrenic, and are difficult to know in advance. I had another case where an Army lieutenant who was living on base, who was highly respected, did not appear to be psychotic, at least outwardly, was silently psychotic without manifest symptoms. And he had the belief that his address, which was 3354, meant he had to kill his entire family, because 3 + 3 adds up to 6, 5 + 4 adds up to 9. That's 69. That's a sign of the devil, which meant the devil had to be living in his house, since he wasn't the devil that left his wife and children. He killed his wife and 2 children, never having committed a criminal act of any kind before, never having been diagnosed with a mental illness before. So as you can see from this example, it can come out of, from the public's point of view, it can come out of nowhere, even for people who are functioning at a fairly high level.
Now, one thing that's potentially offensive to some people about the kind of things that you're talking about is it gives the sense that people may not be responsible for the crimes that they commit. And, someone is like floridly psychotic and disorganized, I think people could understand that. But surely, like from a legal perspective, someone with antisocial personality disorder who had no empathy, who tortured animals as a child, who commits a murder, from a legal perspective, they're 100% responsible. They're going to be sentenced like anyone else, right?
Well, again, presuming that they meet the criteria for sanity, which most sociopaths would meet easily. I mean, there's not many pure sociopaths who have been found insane. That under those circumstances they would be convicted. But you have to understand, from a psychologist's point of view, from a psychiatrist's point of view, from a social worker's point of view, the word responsibility has no meaning. That's not a psychiatric or psychological concept. We ask a different question when we ask what to do with somebody, because that's what this is all about. You make the diagnosis, you make the determination as a way, a pathway to finding out what to do with this human being, whether you punish or rehabilitate. And that's the real question. Is this a person who has some characteristic that can be corrected through the interventions that now exist in psychiatry and psychology? Or does this person have a long-standing personality disturbance, the kind of which can't be cured, for which there is no known effective treatment, and which means he's going to kill again or hurt again, in which case incarceration, or what some people call specific deterrence, is the pathway you have to take. Again, doesn't have to do with being responsible. It has to do with being in a position to prevent future dangerous acts.
When you talk about like antisocial personality disorder, is there some kind of risk that we're sort of over pathologizing, being overly analytical, and can't we just say, these are just evil people who committed evil acts, from the perspective of a non-psychiatrist or non-psychologist, let's say?
Yeah, they have engaged in evil behavior, but real question is, can you say that there is evil as a force in the universe, independent of other forces? Or is evil simply a way we summarize the sentiment that what somebody has done is inexcusable and horrible? And I believe the latter.
Okay, well, so you also, have experience as a lawyer. How many of these people that you're clearly describing have some degree of psychosis would actually get off on murder charges because of insanity and be committed to, say, like a psychiatric facility instead?
My experience personally is not the same as the national average. So let's start off with the national average. The national average is that about 1% of defendants are in a position to make the claim of insanity, and less than 10% of the 1% actually succeed in being found insane. And by the way, in most of those circumstances where somebody qualifies, that the person is kind of crazy out of their mind is observable and detectable by by people without any psychiatric or psychological degrees whatsoever. It is the most extreme of the ill that get it. I myself have testified, not often, because I was usually what they refer to as a prosecution rebuttal expert, but I've testified that people met the criteria to be not guilty by reason of insanity, and they have been found not guilty. But the circumstances were extraordinary. I had one case where, for example, a woman killed a fellow patient on the inpatient unit, the locked ward of a psychiatric facility. She had been hospitalized for florid psychosis but before the homicide occurred, and committed the homicide believing that the woman was an emissary of the devil who had been sent there to destroy her and her family. Here, the honesty of the defense, and by honesty, I mean that there's an absence of malingering, and the totality of the circumstances suggests this is a sick person. And in fact, what happened with her is what happens, by the way, many times, is that the sicker patients are people who have schizophrenia or some other psychotic disorder, get medicated for it. The medication is relatively successful, albeit unpleasant in terms of side effects. They don't like the side effects. They're more concerned about the side effects than the therapeutic effects. They discontinue their medication. They become psychotic, and in the psychotic state, they commit a homicide.
Okay, but the point is that these individuals are very different than someone who has no prior diagnosis of a serious mental illness or overt psychosis. But anyways,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was simply going to say, I think it's important for people to know that there's no legal finding of not guilty by reason of mental illness. The not guilty by reason of insanity has a very specific criteria, and the criteria that it has, and I'll lay it out in its two-part form, has to be understood. First of all, you have to prove someone's insane that they have a mental illness, and you have to prove that as a result of that mental illness, they're incapable or were incapable when they committed their act of knowing the nature and quality of their act, or they were incapable of knowing its wrongfulness. So, for example, a person who has a delusion that God instructed them to do a murder is a person who's incapable of understanding that their action is wrong. A person who thinks that their gun is not a real gun, but actually shoots the cure to AIDS, and it's fired at members of the homosexual community with the idea of saving their lives. That person didn't understand the nature and quality of their life. They didn't understand that this is a real gun that causes death. These are the kind of extreme things, not the kind of psychosocial stresses reported by sociopaths when they want to manipulate the justice system and get a better sentence or a better outcome.
Okay, so that being said, even if legally people are not insane, we can still use an understanding of mental illness to see maybe how interventions could be done to prevent people who are at risk from committing these types of acts. So maybe that's the sort of context where we could talk about Salvador Ramos. And some people said there were so-called red flags, like he had some unusual behaviors. He was very reserved, spending a lot of time by himself, kind of withdrawn. He had no formal diagnosis of mental illness, no criminal record, though he did get in schoolyard fights. Looking at some of the details of the case that have come out, some of the interviews, they say he had a stutter and a lisp, maybe he was bullied a little bit. Is there any sign that he had any kind of mental illness?
Oh, for sure. And the signs manifested themselves more than a year before this particular offense. I mean, he was killing animals on the internet and playing the tapes of the killing of these animals a year before. He was talking about being a school shooter, which, by the way, he was labeled by his peer. He was so strange. He was labeled a peer shooter, right? He was talking about being a peer shooter to intimidate his fellow students long before this homicide occurred. He has a hint of grandiosity and delusions in some things he said at work, where he was working at Wendy's as a relatively low-level hourly worker. if he would get into an altercation with a woman there, which was not uncommon, he had trouble with women, he would look them in the eye and he would say, "You must not know who I am." And there were every indication that he had a kind of grandiose delusion that he was someone special. I imagine that when he went into that school with his weapons and with more than 300 rounds of ammunition, he believed that this killing would launch him into fame and make him the center of a lot of attention, a lot of speculation, and he would be the recipient of the admiration of the people who bullied him and the people who ignored him. He imagined, I suspect, that someday someone's going to say, "Boy, I sure wish I was more careful with him," or "I wish I knew, how powerful he was." And all of this is fantasy on his part, because in reality, like so many people who are grandiose, he was a person of no particular talent and no particular significance.
You remind me of like Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He says everyone has a desire to be great, to be significant, to be special. And it's how you fulfill that desire that defines who you are as a person. So one person may do it through their work, another person through their charity, another person through their family. And unfortunately, there are people like this who are, doing it through acts of violence. You just made me think of that for some reason.
Right. And I completely agree with the saying. And it's easier to do evil than good.
That is definitely true.
And more people have the capacity for evil and the talents for evil. This was a guy who, other than one accomplishment, could not master the most ordinary tasks of life. This is a guy who couldn't finish high school, not because he looks, from whatever I've seen of his behavior, to be about normal intelligence, but couldn't do it because he couldn't control himself to even attend school.
So let's move to like the details of the shooting itself. To me, it seems like there's many aspects that make it clear this was a planned attack, but some aspects that seem a little bit impulsive. For example, 10 days prior to the shooting, he supposedly had an Instagram message stating 10 more days, ... He messaged another woman the morning of the shooting saying, "I'm about to." On Yubo, which is a social media platform that he used, he apparently showed off his rifle. He threatened rapes and school shootings. On May 18th, which is 6 days prior to the attack, he purchased 375 rounds of ammunition. However, on the day of the shooting, I found it kind of odd how he shot his grandmother first, which is kind of unusual. That would sort of draw attention to himself, and maybe decrease the probability of him being successful. He also, instead of just going to the school directly, he drove to the school. Apparently, he didn't even know how to drive. He didn't have a driver's license. He got into an accident driving into an embankment, which seems very unusual that he would kind of coincidentally get into a car accident right before the attack. Then he was outside of the school shooting in, prior to going inside, which seems like not the way that you would carry out a school shooting if you're trying to kill as many people as possible. So it's a little bit strange. Like, to what extent was this planned? To what extent was this impulsive?
Well, I think there are mixed elements. I think you correctly stated that, but you've left out one set of facts that may explain some of this. When he got out of his truck after the crash, which I think is purely a product of him not knowing how to drive and not having a driver's license, when he got out of the car, he was actually seen by two local workers at a funeral home. And when he saw that they saw him, he shot at them several times. Those shots missed. They got back and they phoned the police. He knew, being a rational person, with shots fired near a school at funeral workers who are, law-abiding citizens who have no dispute with anyone, the police were going to be there very shortly. I think in his mind, he became terrified that he was not going to be able to consummate the act of greatness that he was supposed to accomplish that day. He was not going to be able to do it because the police were going to be there any moment. And so I think he began shooting before being in an optimal situation, more because he wanted to get off some shots and maybe get some people killed as early as possible, because his efforts might be frustrated. And as we know, his efforts were ultimately frustrated to a substantial degree. He had he had more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition with him. He had 2 assault rifles. He clearly wasn't planning just to shoot 17 people. He clearly was planning to shoot more. So as it turns out, he did in death what he did in life. He failed.
Okay, so one other aspect shortly before the attack is he actually, admitted to killing his grandmother to a young girl in Germany through this, software Yubo. And so this is from the Guardian article, and I just want to kind of read their exchange. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. So Ramos says, "You know what I'm about to do right now?" She says, "Tell me." He says, "I can't since my grandma hasn't left." And then in a text message, he admits to that he was on the phone. His grandmother was on the phone with AT&T about his phone, and he said, "It's annoying." A few minutes later on Yubo, he said, quote, "I just shot my grandma in the head." So he just admits to murder, over the internet. Then at 11:21 a.m., he wrote, "I'm going to go shoot up an elementary school right now." And it's kind of unusual because the girl later said when she was interviewed that they had chatted on video chat, and she said he seemed happy and comfortable. She didn't note any signs of mental illness, and his parents seemed to be shocked by the attack. They seemed like it came out of nowhere. How is that possible that someone so disturbed? He seemed obviously disturbed to some people, but he passed as normal to many other people.
The answer is that these people usually have delusions, auditory hallucinations, and auditory hallucinations that they are keeping secret. And sometimes those are the first signs of a schizophrenic breakdown. This may have been a guy who was on his way, but had not yet gone all the way to a psychotic break. But none of what you say surprises me. None of it surprises me at all. None of it is inconsistent with him having a severer disorder than sociopathy, although most of his symptoms are consistent with sociopathy. He's an example of how the diagnostic system fails because he has features of so many different disorders, it ceases to be useful to use diagnosis at all.
Okay, so we're speculating. Obviously, you didn't evaluate Ramos while he was alive or anything like that. But would you say, if you were to kind of guess at a possible diagnosis, was he more on the spectrum of antisocial personality disorder? In other words, just a sociopath, or could he have had some kind of prodromal schizophrenia, some prodromal psychosis that contributed to the act?
At a minimum, I would say he had antisocial personality disorder with schizophrenic and narcissistic features. At a minimum, it may really be the other way around. Which you'll perceive as dominant may depend on time. It may be that at 18 years old, he looks healthier and less psychotic than he would at 23 years old. So these diseases have different courses to them. Sociopathic personality disorder begins relatively early in life, is fixed, is non-responsive to treatment, and is resilient against interventions generally. It doesn't involve a rapid change of behavior, where schizophrenia has a rapid change in behavior sometime in adolescence or early adulthood. And when I say rapid, I mean rapid. So that over the course of a year or two, a person can completely transform themselves. And so he may have been long on the path of the sociopathic personality disorder because he was killing animals and showing it on the internet, which is, by the way, a classic sociopathic feature, right? He may have been long on the way to that, fighting, BB guns, shooting people randomly, egging cars, just engaging in criminal behavior. But he may have been in the very incipient stages of a schizophrenic disorder, which would ultimately take over and dominate just because the forces of psychosis and schizophrenia kind of are like a tidal wave that wipe out all the smaller waves around them.
So, from a legal perspective, though, let's say that he were captured and killed, it's very unlikely he would have any chance of any kind of insanity defense. Is that right?
I wouldn't say it's very unlikely. No, I would not. And the reason why I say I would not is the two features that are common to people who have successful offenses are the parts of his conduct that we can't have evaluated yet. You can't evaluate without talking to the person, and that's delusions and auditory hallucinations, especially what a form of hallucination called command hallucinations, where someone hears a voice commanding their behavior, views it as not a thought, which is how a psychiatrist, psychologist, or other health professional would think of it, but as a third person influencing and controlling them. And depending on what their delusion makes that third person, that could be exculpating in terms of insanity defense. And we're not in a position, his death makes it impossible for us to know that. Now, usually we find it out, we can find it out from other sources because there are people who he reports that the delusion, the phenomenon to. But I suspect he was secretive, just like he was secretive over an extended period of time about his intent to go to a school and shoot it up. I think he was holding at bayance the voices and delusions that were driving him.
Okay, so let's say in terms of how we would prevent something like this, a lot of people saw these so-called red flags, the kind of threatening comments he would make. Let's say someone reported it to, I don't know, the police or a social worker. What could be done to stop this kind of thing from happening from a mental health perspective? If you could get this guy to walk into your office, let's say.
One is to just hear him. I mean, people like him tend not to have somebody who they feel trust for and to whom they will tell their secret thoughts and fantasies. That will make all the difference in the world, and only requires that you make more psychotherapists available to more people who are showing the harbinger signs of psychiatric disturbance. I hate to say this, but psychotherapy helps. And when it involves a trusting relationship, it's a powerful tool. We've made it difficult to get because we've made it expensive, and we put a kind of barriers of credentials that are required to do it. But making psychotherapy evaluations a regular part of screening. We entrust to one group of professionals the general screening of all disorders, and that's family practice physicians. If family practice physicians would routinely screen for suicidality, which many of them do now, routinely screen for prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia, which by the way, nowadays in the modern world, you can do on the internet. You can have a little questionnaire before a patient's annual physical. So screening by health professionals, not psychiatrists, because no one's going to be in the hands of a psychiatrist until after the screening. You have to have the screening done by somebody who's a trusted health professional and who's likely to be being seen on a regular basis before. The availability of cheap psychotherapy, and specifically, I believe the availability of group psychotherapy, since almost all people with severe disorders involving sociopathic behavior, including sociopaths and schizophrenics, have impaired social relationships in the group setting. It's in school, it's in the church, it's in the home, right? Where their pathology is manifest. It is in those relationships. Only a person, you tell a person, I know you hate me. I know you want me to fail this test. It's one thing for a psychotherapist to say, oh, he probably doesn't. He probably likes you. Psychotherapists tend to be reflexively reassuring, but reflexive reassurance is of no interest to a schizophrenic or somebody who's sociopathic. But if the person who you're talking about says, I have to tell you, John, I wasn't thinking I hoped you failed. I wasn't thinking I hoped you were a success. I wasn't thinking about you at all, which is usually the case when people project delusional material into other people. So group therapy needs to be more available. And of course, the real treatment for the disorders that are most intense usually ends up being antipsychotic medication.
Okay, well, certainly that could help. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing. there's what I'm going to make the comparison to malaria. You could talk about, you could have asked me if I was a physician, an infectious disease specialist, you could ask me, how can we protect more people? What kind of interventions could you do as a physician to protect people against malaria? And I could tell you, well, I could, ask for questions about whether or not they ever have jaundice, whether they have a fever. I could take their temperature, blah, 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 blah. Okay. That approach, the individual approach, is not inconsistent with, but does not pay obedience to the simple public health measure of eradicating mosquitoes in a certain area. The public health approach to handling these situations is to make the lethality of the killer lower by taking out of his hands things like AR-15s and other automatic weapons that have the capacity to kill large amounts of people in small amounts of time. From a public health point of view, that's the equivalent of eradicating mosquitoes. And you don't say about eradicating mosquitoes, well, you won't be able to kill them all, right? What you say is, if I can eradicate a significant amount, we will have a lower frequency of malaria in our population. So I think the answer to these questions doesn't ultimately lie in psychotherapy, because there are going to be a lot of misses and false positives for this. I mean, dangerousness is over-predicted by almost 100-fold in some populations. And so you have a large number of non-dangerous people being subjected to restraints that should not be. But public health measures don't hurt anyone, because no one really needs to have an AK-47.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. You talked about like possible delusions of grandeur and the idea of getting on the news and being significant somehow. If he just had a handgun, do you think it's possible maybe he would not have gone forward with it because it wouldn't be a mass killing? It would just be maybe a small number of killings, and he wouldn't have felt as great, and he would have sought greatness in a different way. Do you think that's possible?
Well, more possible is that if he's not going to use a gun, he's going to learn how to use explosive devices, which some people do. I don't think his behavior will be greatly affected. I think if what he can get his hands on is a gun, and he's not an expert in making bombs, then he'll get a gun. He'll do that. He'll do whatever it takes to release that pent up tension of hatred that arises probably out of his delusional belief that people are against him. And by the way, keep in mind, he had the belief that people were against him, and people were against him for real. I mean, he was made fun of, he looked kind of funny, he dressed kind of funny, right? This problem we have with bullying in high schools and junior high schools is a real problem, because some people you bully and they cry. Some people you bully and they never forget it, hate the kind of person you are, and do something horrible someday about it. And we don't know in advance who those people are.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a student in my high school who I spoke to who actually got expelled because he made a list of people to kill. And I think he was just joking. I don't know that this particular kid was dangerous. Obviously, they took it very seriously, but there may be hundreds or thousands of these incidents for every one person who actually is dangerous. I have patients who have schizophrenia who see me due to concerns for a neurological disease, and they're not being treated for their schizophrenia, and they may have delusions. And like you said before, the medications are unpleasant, but they're not floridly psychotic. They're not dangerous. They can take care of themselves. They may be working full time. They may have relationships. A layperson may not even notice the signs of schizophrenia. So no one can really make them take medications. So it really is a challenge. I mean, would you say it is essentially impossible to identify people with red flags and stop them from getting guns?
You're not going to identify them all. Whatever effort you make in this is like taking efforts against the cold virus. You're not going to eliminate colds in our culture. We're not going to eliminate gun violence. And keep in mind, I hate to say this because it'll sound insensitive. We're a nation of more than 300 million people. As a fraction of 300 million, the number of people who are killed in school shootings is very, very small. We're not as violent as the evening news makes us look, because they don't show all the instances of normal behavior. they don't show all the instances of kindness. And we get so excited about the plethora of school shootings that we lose sight of the fact that large numbers of people, not the majority, but the super majority of people, go through the entire school system never subject to any form of violence whatsoever. And we mustn't lose sight of that. We mustn't destabilize the good part of that equation to attempt to cure the bad part of that equation.
Well, sure, like statistically, the risk is very low, but it is traumatic to people. And obviously there's some kids who are afraid to go to school, who are thinking about it. And, it is very disturbing, to our public consciousness, even though statistically it's very rare.
What I would hope is the public would understand, because of course they have a right to and should be concerned even about a low frequency of a terrible act, that we need to take public health like responses to this, not use the individualized weapons of psychotherapy and psychotropics as our only bulwark against horrible acts.
Yeah. Now, you seem to imply earlier that, okay, people with schizophrenia, maybe if they could be diagnosed and treated with psychotherapy or antidopaminergics, cut down on their delusions, that could help. But what about people with antisocial personality disorder? Kids who just are constantly getting into bad behavior, torturing animals, getting into fights, showing no empathy to other people. They've had it since they were very young. You seem to imply that there's not much that can be done about it. Is that true, or are there interventions? Or
Well, there is an intervention. There are interventions. And that is a more vigorous enforcement of the criminal law. We need to be willing to give up on a group of our population if that's necessary to achieve peace in our culture. People who show sociopathic trends in their behavior and commit crimes should go to jail for a long time. And every time they commit a crime, it should be lost people from our culture. You have to deserve the benefits of our culture to stay a part of our culture. And what we've done with the criminal justice system is we've made it hard for people to be incarcerated in the way they need to be in order for the system to work. And what behavioral psychologists discovered really at the very beginning of this century was that the punishment for a crime or the punishment for a behavior to have the effect of suppressing the behavior, reducing its frequency, doesn't have to be that severe. What it has to be is certain. You need to be caught. If you're caught a high percentage of the time and punished moderately, you can exercise control over that behavior. The other thing is, there's a saying in a musical song by Janis Joplin: freedom is having nothing left to lose. A lot of sociopaths have such horrible lives that the punishment, like incarceration, doesn't have much of an effect on them. They don't lose much. They probably live better incarcerated than they live outside. Now, Salvador Ramos is a little bit different than other psychopaths and other schizophrenics because his relationship to work was different. He was working steadily in the same job without problems for more than a year prior to the assault. That's something you see very rarely amongst psychopaths, especially severe psychopaths, and very rarely amongst schizophrenics. So he had a twinkle of strength in his character that allowed him to wake up in the morning, put on his clothes, go there, do it, and not get fired for more than a year. That means he had to conform his behavior to the requirements of law and workplace for over a year. So for him, some intervention that involved work and creating work incentives, maybe pay raises, et cetera, might have been the kinds of things that would help divert him from things that you only do when you have nothing left to lose. But the way it is, he was trapped in a low position. No one recognized the greatness that was in him. He knew at an unconscious level, but not a conscious level, that he was not going to succeed. and he was angry. And, unadorned anger is the centerpiece of murder.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. If there's no hope, it makes it more likely someone's going to do something desperate. So you talked a lot about potential interventions. Is there any other potential intervention that we haven't mentioned so far?
I can't think of one as I sit here.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you for taking the time to do the interview. And any questions in the comments below, we'll go back to multiple sclerosis videos next week.
Thank you.